Welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast, produced by the Technology Addiction team at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. I'm Dr. Sally Gainsbury. I'm a Professor of Psychology here at the Brain and Mind Centre. This season is titled Informed Decisions, Financial Behaviour in Persuasive Digital Environments. Across these conversations, I'm asking a central question. What does it take for people to form intentions about money and follow through on them when the digital environments they're navigating are specifically designed to influence their behaviour? This season is supported by BetWell, a tool developed by our team at the Brain and Mind Centre, which enables people to bet with more insight, intention and clarity. BetWell is exactly the kind of example of the intervention we'll be looking at in this season. It's designed to close the gap between what people actually intend to do and they do. You can find more out at betwell.org.au. Today, I'm really excited to be kicking off our Early Career Researcher series, which started off throughout each of the 6 seasons of the TRG webinar series. And today I'm speaking with Dr. Mandeep Singh, a finance researcher at the University of Sydney and a co-author of the study that I've actually been involved in. So, as I mentioned, Dr. Mandeep Singh is a lecturer in finance at the University of Sydney Business School, where his research spans climate finance, financial intermediation with empirical asset pricing. For this episode, we're discussing the study he co-authored with myself and our colleagues, Dr. Robert Herring, Crystal Tortes, and Susan Thorpe, a study that brings the rigour of financial economics to gambling research, following over 24,000 Australian sports bettors across a full year of transaction-level data. This project in collaboration was funded and supported by the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. The paper is publicly available in its preprint format, and I will add a link to it in the show notes. So Mandeep, welcome and over to you. Welcome, Mandeep. I'm very pleased to have you here with us. Thank you so much for joining on the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast series. You and I have worked together and I'm really excited for you to be able to share the results as they currently stand of this collaboration. So I'm going to hand it over to you to talk us through these findings.
Thank you so much, Sally, for having me today. Yeah, it's a great project, mainly because the problem of gambling is quite real. So it was quite fulfilling. This particular project. So I'll just start with the overview of the project, trying to keep it as simple as possible. So the title of the paper is Wins, Windfalls and Willpower, Liquidity and Self-Regulation in Online Sports Gambling. So again, it's a co-authored work with Crystal from UNSW and yourself and Robert from University of Sydney and Susan, who's now at Monash University. So just the big motivation for this paper is that sports betting, at least in Australia, is marketed as entertainment. It's embedded, normalized and experienced as sports entertainment. We go to stadiums, we can bet there. We go to pubs, we can bet there. Some of the players' jerseys have these advertisements, and at the same time, advertising is also there. Although there has been some recent changes to the advertising of gambling platforms or sports betting platforms. So again, this is quite integrated into the culture of Australia. But if we think from the perspective of finance and economics, so there are a few things that pretty much in your face, right? One is that the money that we use to bet is real. So it has real consequences for the overall budget of an individual or a household. And then we think about when the outcome of the bet is realized, the feedback is immediate. You really know whether you lost or you made some money. And then depending on the outcome, you can always deposit more money if you want to bet more, or you can withdraw money in case if you do not. So if you think from a perspective of standard economics utility maximization problem, this is basically a very high frequency a sequence of risky decisions that a person is making, and then again they realize some gains, they realize some losses, and at the same time they are also constrained because nobody has infinite amount of money in this world. So what do we focus on this paper? We focus on three important things. One is feedback, the second is liquidity, and the third is self-control. So what do I mean by feedback? Feedback is that every time a bet is resolved, where you know whether a person has made a loss or a gain, that consequence itself is prompting another action, whether to bet and how much to bet and what sort of odds to take. And then that action again has consequences, which again leads to action. So this is precisely what we mean by feedback, that the realization of a bet actually prompts the another decision to bet and how much to bet. And then at the same time, this is not like these gambling or the sports betting, the way it works. This is not like a place where the platform will give you some sort of credit that you can bet more and you can pay us later. Generally, you need liquidity, you need cash, and then depending on how much money you have on the side, it will determine how much you can bet. And lastly, which I think is a very novel angle in this particular project, is the self-regulation. A lot of the time when you think from the perspective of behavioral economics or psychology, whether a person has a problem that is clinically determined rather than somebody voluntarily trying to signal that they perceive their behavior as a little bit problematic. So this is something that I'll talk a little bit later about. This is about self-regulation of your own behavior as a bettor. And then some preview of the findings. So we use data from two major Australian online betting platforms, history of approximately 24,000 randomly selected bettors over 1 year period from March 23 to February 24. We do observe quite a bit of detailed data on the bet itself and certain demographic characteristics of the individuals. So the main findings of this paper is first one is that these wins and losses, these series of results of bets that are placed in the past, they actually determine the so-called participation, whether you will place a bet or not, and the speed with which you will return to bet again. And at the same time, it will also determine how much you're going to bet, which is what I'm referring to as monetary exposure. We do see that risk allocation, the outcome raises the stakes, but generally lowers the odds. So they do not introduce systematic movements towards speculative bets. So it doesn't really change the risk margin. But it does affect the intensive and extensive margin of betting. That is how much, whether you bet, and if you do, how much you bet. And then we have liquidity. So the idea is that I guess the motivation for us was that a lot of the time when we study gambling as an issue or a health problem, we think from the perspective of psychological drivers of somebody placing a bet. But again, the external environment of a bettor can also affect whether they are going to bet or not, or their betting behavior. So liquidity is one of those. So what do we do? So a lot of the times the Australian population is paid on Wednesdays. So we use those post-payday liquidity, which is quite exogenous to the behavior of the individual. And we see whether it actually amplify or attenuates the feedback behavior that we document in the first part of the paper. And lastly, we look at self-regulation. So all these tools that are designed by the platform to as an avenue for bettors to curb their bad betting behavior. So do they work? I guess on average they do, but do they change the feedback-driven behavior or these biases that bettors exhibit? The evidence that we find in this paper is quite limited. Okay, so data I have already gone through a little bit about, but just want to highlight that the better characteristics that we observe are age, gender, postcode, and whether the person is identified as at-risk bettor or not, and this is determined by the operator, not by us. And then some descriptives. This is because this is quite new to at least finance audience, which is why I have this particular slide. So a lot of the times, the bets, so these simple fixed odds, win, losses, these single bets dominate. Complex high odd bets are very rare in the sample. And the sample itself is very heavily skewed towards males and younger adults. And then this is what I find very interesting in the paper, that almost all transactions are digital. And to me, this is basically minimizing the time between a person making a decision that they want to place a bet and them actually placing the bet. So this psychological distance is quite reduced. And I think this could be like, one of those policy levers that people can use to basically lower the gambling harm among the Australian population, lower transaction friction, as I said, distance between impulse and deposit and wager, and the activity expectedly it spikes towards some of the major sporting events, in Australia. Melbourne Cup, for instance, is one, and then the weekends, especially the Saturday, is the highest activity day consistent with sporting calendar, because most of the games, they do happen on the weekend. Okay. And at the same time, I like this particular plot. So again, some caveats are necessary. Please note that this is something that is based on the sample that we have. So the average bettor in our sample loses approximately $2,500 per year, and that amounts to approximately a profit margin by the platforms of approximately 11%. So I think from an economic standpoint, what makes this particular graph interesting is that the expected return on their investment, if you think of a bet as an investment, is negative, right? So still, the bettors are coming back to the platform and betting more. So this is the central tension, like why people will keep on betting if the expected return on bets is negative. And this is precisely where these behavioral aspects come in place. And the empirical design that we have is that we have something called dependent variable Y. So this is the outcome variable which we want to study. And then our main explanatory variables are whether a bettor experienced a loss in the previous day, and then whether they have a win in the previous day. So this could be a dummy variable of 0 and 1, whether they have a win or a loss, or it could be the actual amount. But then we also have to worry about quite a few things. One is that the average behavior of bettors is different. For instance, males behave differently compared to females, and at the same time, young individuals behave differently compared to old individuals. So we have something called gamma I, which is this particular symbol here. So this is something that we call bettor fixed effects. So the idea is that we want to compare a person's deviation from their own average behavior. So that means that we're only comparing the deviations of individuals across individuals, right? So their baseline behavior is controlled for their risk preferences or their incomes or their betting style. And then we also have something called gamma T, which is we refer to as date fixed effects. So this is important because there could be certain events that will affect everybody at the same time. Sports for that, because if there's a game happening between New South Wales and Queensland rugby teams, then this is a common event to everybody. All the bettors who want to bet on that game, they will bet pretty much, they will be affected at the same time. So we need to control for such things. So the variation that we're using in this particular paper is basically same bettor experiencing different realized outcomes on different days. Okay, so what do we find? So you can see that if you win on the previous day, the bet placed, the probability of placing a bet contemporaneously increases by approximately 9 percentage points, and then and approximately 6 percentage point if you make a loss. And then when conditional on you placing a bet, that means bet placed is equal to 1. The cash stake is also increasing, but the bet odds are becoming a little bit lower, although the economic significance of the bet odds is quite low. So what do we understand from a very simple economic standpoint? So after wins, bettors are more likely to return and stake more, which is what the coefficient shows, approximately 9 percentage points. And after losses, bettors are also re-engage and then there's a certain things that we have done in the paper about the medium, small, and large losses, and then turns out the effect is quite monotonic, which means that it cannot be just a fluke, whatever we are finding. And then both wins and losses, they generally reduce average odds, which is, and lower odds correspond to higher probability bets. So the thing that is quite evident from this particular table is that we are not the previous outcomes of bets. They are affecting intensive and extensive margin of betting. That means whether you are going to place a bet, and if you do, how much you're going to bet, not like, the odds of that particular bet. So from a behavioral economic standpoint, so what it suggests is that this reinforcement where consequence affect actions, which again affect the consequence, that reinforcement is present. And the gains where you either become overconfident that you're going to win a game. So the gains do carry a little bit of house money component. That means you have recouped your initial betting amount plus you receive something more, which is the house money component. But the losses, they also carry a little bit of loss chasing through long short bets. Although the long short bets is not the dominant component because the risk margin is relatively low. And then another confounding explanation of all this is that perhaps we are capturing the heterogeneity or the differences among individuals because they are facing different betting opportunities. Because you could be betting in March, I could be betting in, let's say, October. So obviously the games that are available or the betting opportunity or the sports or the games that are available to us are different. So perhaps we are just capturing these differences. So what we do in another part of the paper now is we try to fix the betting opportunity across bettors. That means we will, although we do not observe the underlying events in the data, but we use certain features of the data to basically infer that indirectly. So we look at the platform and we look at the sports and the market, and then we look at the settlement minute of the bet, and we focus on simple bets, like single fixed win bets, like either a loss or a gain. So when you look at a minute of the settlement, the idea is that if you and I are betting and then our settlement time is the same and we have fixed win on the same sports, then it's quite possible that you and I are betting on the same event or the same sports. And then we try to see whether these bettors prior to this particular event or the game that we are betting on, whether their prior wins and losses, they actually affect their contemporaneous betting behavior. And again, like, whatever we find in our baseline results, the main pattern holds that generally we find that intensive and extensive margin of betting is affected. Okay, so we can claim that these feedback effects that we document in our baseline results, these are not like simple event selection effects. And then the second part of the paper focuses on the liquidity part, like, where if you receive, like, your payday today, do you all of a sudden, like, do you bet more if you win, or do you bet more if you lose? And then the new liquidity shock that we have in this paper is predictable salary timing. So I think the payday cycle of Australia works in a way that most people get paid during midweek, just to avoid. I think there are certain reasons for it, which are not really central to the paper. But we compare basically Thursdays with Tuesdays because Tuesdays is probably the last day before you get your salary, and Thursdays is the first day where you actually have the paycheck in your bank account. And then we create like a balance panel. So for all the individuals, we have like 48 hours per week, 24 hours from Tuesday and 24 hours on Thursdays. And then we just try to see, like, on the basically on Thursday, whether the betting behavior driven by feedback is different from that on Tuesday, and is it statistically significant? So the ultimate question this particular setting is trying to answer is, does liquidity amplify feedback-driven betting? And turns out they do. Liquidity amplifies participation response by 14% for wins and 25% for losses. And then conditional on betting. The second column is the one I'm referring to. Liquidity also raises the expenditure by approximately 26 to 30%. So these are the 0.017 and 0.012. These are the two key coefficients that we're looking at. And again, the baseline effects remains the same. So generally, the main margin is monetary commitment rather than the speculative intensity, where you're not picking relatively more risky or less risky bets generally. It's how whether you bet and how much you bet. So these are the two important dimensions that we are focusing on. And the third dimension of the paper, which I find relatively novel, but Sally, you work in psychology, perhaps you probably have done so much work on this. So this is voluntary self-regulation. So safe gambling tools, they include you can have limits on how much you're going to deposit into your betting account, or you can have time management restrictions where you're saying that I will not spend more than 5 hours per week on this. Market restrictions, whether you're going to bet only on car races but not on tennis. Self-exclusion is basically you completely go out of the platform. You do not have access to it. And lastly, you have awareness nudges. So if you're using the platform, if you have used it or spend more money than the set limit, then you receive a notification. So why it is interesting from an economic standpoint? So the tool adoption to us, I think it reveals that a person perceives their behavior as a little bit problematic, right? And their willingness to constrain their future choices that they make in terms of betting. So these tools, to an extent, they work like commitment devices. So the idea is that if they do work as commitment devices, then the feedback responses after wins and losses, they should attenuate those responses when the tools are active. And then how prevalent these tools are, not a lot. Only 15% of the bettors adopt any tool at all. There are multiple versions, so we have consolidated, but there are a bunch of tools. And although this share is relatively high among at-risk bettors, and that is expected because they are at risk of gambling harm as identified by the platform. And then deposit limit is probably the most dominant of all voluntary so-called safe gambling tools that is available to bettors on these platforms. So ultimate question is, does the feedback-driven betting that we document in our baseline results, does these tools attenuate those? Generally, if you look at the average effect, just ignore everything else, then you can see that it does increase the extensive margin. Basically, the probability of placing the bet goes up, but the amount you spend on each bet, it goes down. But does it have any effect to curb the behavior or the response, the feedback response that you will have to your prior wins versus prior losses? Turns out they do not curb such behavioral biases. Okay, so I think this to me was relatively nice, because a lot of the time the platforms, they do provide these safe gambling tools. There are two possible reasons, at least according to me. One is that they generally care about the bettors' well-being, and then they to them this is probably the least they can do. That if you perceive your behavior as problematic, please use some of our tools. Or the second reason is that they are purely satisfying some of the regulation that the government is asking them to do something about the gambling harm that is prevalent among public. So again, they do not really curb the biases that we document in this particular paper. So what are the policy implications of all this for us? So one is that, which I think is relatively easier to do, is to reduce this frictionless escalation. Anytime I do not have enough money in my account, only thing I need to do is just jump on an app and then just deposit the money, either via credit card or just a simple bank transfer, which is also one of those instantaneous transfers. The second one is although a lot of the time we talk about the extensive margin, that we should actually stop people from participating in in betting, sports betting. But I think another lever that we should also focus on is the monetary exposure. Betting itself is not a big problem if the expenditure on betting is very, very small or even zero, if we can get that, which means no betting. And then finally, we need to work on a little bit on these safe gambling tools as commitment devices. A lot of the time, I think one of the simple lever is that the decision to activate a safe gambling tool should lie with the bettor. But to deactivate it, I think there has to be some sort of friction where they had to call the platform so that there is a 5 or 6 minute lag time, which could be quite discouraging for some people. And then they call the platform, and then the platform deactivates it for them. I think that's one of the simplest things I can think of. So that's the overview of the paper. It's still pretty much a work in progress. So I'm very happy to answer any other questions or talk more about this, because this is, to me, I think it's quite fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandeep. It's so appreciated for you to go through that very technical work that and collaboration that we've been doing. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to drill down on some of these. The first I think that I'm really interested in is we often assume that someone starts gambling with an intention and follows through. But I think what you're showing is really the importance of what actually happens during the session. The wins and the losses are shaping gambling behavior. And this is something we don't typically account for. When we're looking at something like identifying gambling harm, we often look at losses and chasing behavior. But you're also pointing out that these can only occur if there is liquidity there. And the absence of loss chasing is not indicative necessarily of the absence of a problem. So I was hoping you could take me through a little bit more of what this pattern looks like in the data and why it's important that it goes that both wins and losses have an impact. What are the kind of implications for us when we're thinking about understanding whether gambling is intentional, unintentional, and how potentially problematic that is?
So I guess the main issue is, I can answer the question from a behavioral standpoint. So I think generally when we think from a psychological standpoint, yes, we look at like loss chasing, that you're losing bets, but still you're betting, because the argument these gamblers will end up giving you is like, I cannot lose all the time. There has to be one point where I will win. But that's basically gambler's fallacy kind of argument. But the problem with wins is that a lot of the time these events are to an extent they are somewhat like, independent in the sense. So the idea is that if I win this time, I do become overconfident, and then I bet again, which is also not like a great outcome. So this is why wins can also be dangerous, because you cannot just like you cannot lose all the time, you cannot win all the time. And then the other thing that I find a little bit weird, in at least when we spoke about some of these issues with some of my students who actually gamble on these platforms, this is how I was gaining insights, is that they do see these things as like entertainment, which is also a little bit weird to me. Like, you're losing money, you might as well eat something. But they're like, it's okay. Weekend $50 is okay, but that's a lot as a student. So yeah, I mean, there are certain issues like why wins are also problematic. And then people also tend to maintain a little bit of a mental account things, as in like, as if they have this whole thing with the house that, I lost 500, so you owe me 500. This is how they think and they talk about it, at least my conversation with certain people who gamble a bit. So to them, it's pretty much like, chasing some sort of, I don't know, adrenaline kind of thing.
I think that's a really interesting point, that you do have that dual layer, because you're obviously just looking at the numbers, you're looking at analysis of just player behavior, but it is really important to think about what's driving that. And I think the field of problem gambling has focused a lot on individual characteristics. So someone has a level of impulsivity or self-control or distorted beliefs, and that's what's, separating or driving behavior. But the important thing that you've shown here is that this reinforcement effect of the win or the loss happens across the board. These weren't in subsamples. These were happening across the whole population. And I think that really shifts what we're thinking of in terms of what we mean by risk and that interaction between what's commonly thought of as a small proportion of people who are impacted by the product, as opposed to this being the actual, this is just what happens for everybody. Obviously, there's going to be a difference in the extent to which that happens. But I think it's really important that we're focusing beyond just the individual difference here.
Yeah, and I guess, like, if you remember, Sally, like, the kind of motivation we had before we started working on this project is, I think, coming from your side, is that we understand the psychological drivers, but, like, there could be certain external environment of the bettor themselves that could drive them to bet more. So I can give you an example. Like, for instance, like in 2008, when Australia, there was recession pretty much everywhere else, the Australian government, they gave $800 to all the taxpayers who paid any sort of tax since 2006 and 7. And I think many people took that money and ended up in casinos.
Yeah, it was called the pokies and plasma, stimulus payout for the non-Australians.
And in economics, there's another concept called reaching for the yield. So if you're not making a lot of money, then you may as well undertake riskier investments. So if you think from the perspective of what happened post-COVID, is that we had quite a bit of high inflation, which means that we also had like increases in interest rates. So mortgages in Australia, they are adjustable rates. So every time you as an investor who's renting a house, or you as a homeowner who lives in a house, your mortgage repayments have gone up, or you have passed that on to the renter, which means the renter's rent has gone up. And in that particular from that standpoint, the disposable income that you're left with is reduced. So perhaps if you are a bettor, you probably end up betting more, because you need to get some sort of yield.
I think that's really interesting. And so I want to talk about then your finding on safer gambling tools, because that was really unique and something we haven't had a lot of data on. So the fact that you could analyze this data. Can you take me through what the betting journey suggests about when should we be encouraging people to set tools up in Australia at the very beginning, before someone essentially, when they create an account, they're prompted to set a deposit limit, and then once a year they get another message, and then they're available at other times. And so people are setting them at different rates. What do these findings suggest about when should we be nudging or encouraging people to set a limit?
I think we did some tests on this. I think right after the losses, I think that's probably where the probability of somebody adopting a tool is the highest. So I think this is just a simple notification that the platforms can set up, that if any of the bettors make any loss anytime, they should be nudged a little bit that maybe you want to have any of these tools that you can adopt. And then deposit limit is one of them, but there are multiple others. I think self-exclusion is probably the strongest of all, which may not be there, but that's the time that right immediately after loss, you tell people that hey, maybe you want to adopt this.
Keeping them in place, because we do see, obviously, you're also looking at people toggling them, turning them off as well.
So there are two ways to think about it. So we did find some evidence, but it was not super robust, which is why it's not in the paper, at least in the new version. Is that people tend to the probability of turning on and off, it actually goes up immediately after losses. Turning on increases after losses, and turning on also increases after wins. And then I guess there are two reasons. The way we think about this is that perhaps you made some money, now you just want to relax a little bit. But at the same time, when you look at the probability of turning things off, that also increases post wins and post losses, which I thought was interesting. And again, this is where we think it's consistent with the fact that you lost your money. Now you want to recoup it back, which is the loss chasing behavior that we documented in the baseline results. But after wins, they turn it off so that they become overconfident, and then they want to bet more. So all these things become a little bit consistent. But the reason is that, like, if we have bettors' welfare in mind, we should nudge them to adopt a tool uh, after the losses. But the decision is something that the bettor can have. Like, it should remain with them. And my idea is that if they have to turn it off, if they do it themselves, then this commitment device will not work, because anytime I change my mind, I can turn it off. So perhaps they want to have some sort of request sent to the platform where somebody at the platform or the customer consultants, they actually turn them off. And then this again, this is all we are trying to do, is increase the psychological distance between their urge to bet and then their ability and they're actually placing the bet.
Yeah, so looking at slowing it down. I think that's really consistent with the design, and it is a difficult balance between individuals' choice and they're making choices constantly. At what stage is their optimal choice if they're choosing different outcomes at different times? But the really great thing about this research is it highlights the importance of looking at wins as a really critical decision-making point. And I think a lot of focus has been on losses, about, well, are they losing too much money? And when they're winning, there's no concern. Whereas I think a win can actually be when someone is really at a critical decision point that we need to explore further. And I guess that's something I'm really interested in looking at as well, as because we're looking at loss chasing, presuming that means that there's, potentially problems, and the absence of loss chasing mean there's not problems. But what you're really clearly showing is liquidity. When you add that in there, not chasing losses may simply mean you don't have any funds left available.
So so you can say that, but we haven't explored the deposits the way they do that quite a bit, because I think I have not yet been successful in actually creating the overall balances. So I think it'll be interesting to study at least in the next version of the payload.
I think then that's something I want to get to. But before I ask you where your research is going next, I want to bring it together and ask you, if you were speaking to a stakeholder, if you were speaking to a policymaker, if you were speaking to an operator, and you wanted them to take something away from this study, what do you think are the key takeaways you want people to be thinking of?
Not really based on the paper, but the data that I have looked at. One thing I'm quite interested in is the safe gambling tools. So the menu of safe gambling tools is quite high. So what we put in the paper, we simplify and classify them into simple groups. But I think if I was a bettor, I would be super confused with, like, what each of these tools are. I think they want to simplify that, and I think that is always appreciated by the users. I think marketing research has shown that very conclusively. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that, like, perhaps they want to have some sort of rule that, like, we want to curb your monetary behavior, that if you win, you cannot bet more than your lost amount, or you cannot bet more than your last amount that you lost. But as we saw, monetary exposure is something that we really want to focus on as well, because a lot of the discussion in regulation is all about participation in gambling. But rather than that, we probably want to focus on how much they bet in response to their previous wins and losses.
That's really clear. Then the final thing I want to ask you, Mandeep, is that you're continuing to work in this. Where are you excited to go to next? What's the research that you're going to do? And if you could put a call out, what's the data you don't have that you would like to
have? I think one of the important, so few reasons, right? So if you want to draw some parallels with stock market, people say that this is as good as random as stock market, like, where so from that particular standpoint, I think one data set that I would really like to use is the actual event that underlie that bet, because what it does is that few things I can observe. So if I have the actual underlying event, then I can track the history of each individual till that event is concluded, then I can see that, hey, I placed a bet, then I canceled it. Then I placed a bet, then I placed an opposite bet. So I can actually see whether these gamblers are as naive as we observe in the data at the moment, or some of them are sophisticated where they're hedging their bets as well. So I think that gives us a relatively more true picture of like, their true gambling behavior. At the moment, what we are seeing is what we are observing on average. But like, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the underlying bets that we are not able to explore. And I think from a policy standpoint, it will be really cool to see if these bettors hedge, and this is relatively next level of research, because in finance and economics, when we study stock markets, for instance, we do not observe the terminal value of their investments, but here we do. If you bet $10, 2 days later, whether your payoff is zero or you made some money. So that's cool. I think it'll highlight certain other levers for us to focus on when it comes to behavior of bettors.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Mandeep, to join me and take me through in so much detail of this research. It's been an absolute pleasure collaborating with you and with the team. For me, coming from psychology, I love working in a multidisciplinary way, and I think that this research really demonstrates how important it is to learn from different fields, and your questions coming from finance are very complementary to the questions we have in psychology, but we're doing ourselves a disservice not bringing them together. So I really appreciate you having the opportunity to do this research and to follow through and be able to share it broadly.
Yeah, I think it's all made possible by you, because the data set itself is your own effort, and then I think the funding from Brain and Mind Center is, again, like, I think these things go a long way. So I think I'm totally with I totally share your sentiment that we should do more multidisciplinary work.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to today.
No worries. Thank you so much, Al.
That's Dr. Mandeep Singh. What I took away from that conversation is how important it is to challenge something the field has assumed for a long time, that gambling behaviour is intentional, and it's really about who people are, the individual differences. What this research shows when we look at scale at gambling behaviour data in its actual form is that we're seeing what happens during a session matters enormously. It's not necessarily what someone intended to do, but it's the wins and the losses, those experiences within the gambling session, that drives the behaviour. And it's not just all about the losses, but the wins are just as important in terms of the reinforcement dynamics at work. And importantly, it's not only a small proportion of people who are influenced by these events. It's not just that 1% or people who we would identify as vulnerable. This research has really important implications for when and how we intervene. It shows that suggesting people set up safer gambling tools before they start gambling, when they're creating an account, may not be the most useful time. But what we really need to do is look at safer gambling tools as a more fluid opportunity for people, and look at within session encouraging people to engage with these, both in terms of setting them and keeping them in place. It also highlights the importance of considering liquidity, or how many funds people have available to them, and not just looking at short-term loss chasing, but really looking at what opportunities people have and whether they've simply run out of funds, they're choosing to take a break, or what is happening for them. Again, the preprint for this whole paper is linked in the show notes today and will be submitted for publication later on. If today's question raised questions for you, I would encourage you to read it. And of course, please feel free to leave a comment. And if you loved this, please share it with a colleague or with a friend. Leave me a comment, or even better, a 5-star rating, so that we can get those metrics and continue to make the show as amazing as possible. Before I close out, I would like to acknowledge that this episode was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I recognise and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging on these lands, and also on the lands of which you are listening. This podcast was produced by the Technology Addiction team at the Brain and Mind Centre of the University of Sydney, and I would like to say a huge thanks to the production team who are supporting me, including Eunice Huing and Asha Osborne. I'm Sally Gainsbury. Thanks for listening.